Welcome back to the People's Basics, the home of the universal basics. It's time for us to do another episode of the People's Platform, and we decided we want to talk to some of the folks we've talked to in the past more often so that we can really get deeper knowledge into the subjects that we're passionate about and so that you can build some more familiarity with members of the community. We talked recently to Sara Wolk about the notion of alternative voting methods, part of her advocacy in Equal.vote as well as in the star voting community. This time we wanted to kind of deep dive on one of the things we started to talk about last time, and that was the impact of ranked choice voting on the election that occurred in the New York City mayoral race. We had done a deep dive this past spring in that mayoral race, and this was the first time they implemented ranked choice voting in New York City. And so we want to look at some of the results from this large population set of what kind of played out from that. Before we get into that, we want to remind you all, please make sure that you're joining our community. We want people here joining the home of the universal basics so that we can have more people amplifying causes related to the universal basics so that we can all help it out and so we can help that grow so that we can all have these common basics for ourselves. So make sure you check the description section to sign up for an episode, get involved in the movement, etc., and make sure you're subscribed for future episodes. Without further ado, let's bring on Sara Wolk to talk about the New York City race. Okay, hello Sara, welcome back to the program.
Hi, it's good to be here again. Thanks for having me back.
You're very welcome. So Sara, the last time we spoke, we were talking a lot about alternative voting methods, as well as specifically one of the most recent examples, which was in New York City, them using ranked choice voting. I wanted to ask you observing this race, was there anything that unexpectedly came out or things that you think were noteworthy from watching this election?
There were a lot of things that were noteworthy, but one of the difficult things from a perspective of somebody who's working in this field, who's been engaged with ranked choice voting and alternative voting for a long time, is how many of the things that came up weren't unexpected. So it really was, in many ways, a classic example of why ranked choice voting isn't totally ideal for competitive races or races at a bigger scale, particularly races with multiple viable candidates. And we can get into that, but definitely from an election science perspective, a lot of the things that we saw embodied were predicted, you know, from not only the actual error that happened with the tabulation, but with exhausted ballots and ballot spoilage and voter confusion and impacts that had in terms of voters' experience or confidence in the system itself.
So this was something that New York City very recently passed. I'm pretty sure it was by a direct ballot initiative that the people in New York City, I think a super majority, around like 75%, voted for ranked choice voting. Obviously, there were some possible flaws that you just mentioned, but do you think people were satisfied as an improvement compared to past systems, or do you think because of some of the delays you mentioned, do you think there was general dissatisfaction? Have you seen any data or anecdotes by the people running the elections that found there was any dissatisfaction or satisfaction with the change from first past the post to ranked choice?
That's a difficult thing to quantify, and I don't have the polling data on that. But what I was impressed to see actually is how many people, took the issues that came up in stride. Our current voting method, choose one only plurality voting, is specifically the least accurate, the worst, least representative, objectively bad system out there. And so pretty much anything is going to be an improvement. And so even with these hiccups, it seemed like the majority of candidates in particular and New York City elections and the media did seem to keep it framed on like, okay, well, at least, we have a better voting method. But the question I think is how much better, and really seeing like, is there something that can be learned from this? Is this a step in the direction of voting reform, or is this we've arrived and the problem's been solved.
Yeah, and I think we're gonna have to continue to study this, because it's one of the interesting things is you're not gonna have the same design in every location. I know New York City's ballot design had it that you rank 5 choices on their ballot, and then beyond that, if you wanted more candidates, too bad, you're out of luck. So that kind of brings up the exhausted ballot point. But were there other things that were specific kind of New York City implementation that were kind of unique, or things that we could call out? Like, obviously there's the 5 slots only. Was there anything else that you would note that was interesting by design?
Yeah, so in general, with ranked choice voting elections, there's a bit of a trade-off that you have to look at. If in order for the results to be fully representative, voters need to be allowed to rank all the candidates, and they need to actually rank all the candidates. So definitely in terms of voter behavior, as a voter, you should rank as many candidates as possible. But we have cognitive load to take into account as well, and also ballot formatting, like restraints and constrictions, tabulation complexity. So most jurisdictions limit the number of candidates who can be ranked, and New York chose 5, which is kind of right in the middle of what voters can process to reduce voter error. So in general, in ranked choice voting elections, let's see here, about 4 to 8% of ballots usually will be spoiled, which is to say, like, voter error will cause the ballot to just not be countable. They may be ranked 2 candidates, 3rd choice, or something like that. And so those ballots are thrown away. They don't get to count. And that's compared to about 1 to 3% in the choose one plurality voting method. So I think New York City had a hard choice to say, are we going to limit it to 5 only, which means that a lot of voters will have exhausted ballots that are wasted and not able to be counted in the final round. And we can talk more about that. Or do we want to limit it to mitigate the number of spoiled ballots? So there's a few different ways RCV can waste your vote. And obviously nobody wants to have their vote wasted. That's kind of the whole point of why we want a better voting method. So unfortunately, there isn't a choice there that you can make that solves the problem.
So let me ask you this. Was there any influence in kind of the results based on taking this new voter method? Did any of the candidates benefit from this system? Did it encourage a more centrist candidate? Obviously, Eric Adams was the candidate who was elected and then won the general election later in the fall, but he won a very close final result against, if I'm not mistaken, Catherine Garcia was the final person he went up against. Was there anything did that help Eric Adams? Would he have had a bigger lead if it was just plurality voting or another method? How do you feel like it influenced the final result at all?
Well, it's hard to say. So in order to know, did the election elect the correct winner, the most representative winner, what we would really need is not only voters' preference order, but we need voters' level of support as well. How much or how little did they like their second choice? Is their second choice their lesser evil, or is their second choice as good as their favorite? And since we don't have that data, we can't objectively say as an outsider who should have won. But Eric Adams was the Condorcet winner, which is one of the things for ranked elections we'll look at to say, like, did this election succeed or did it fail to get the candidate that the voters asked for? So he was preferred head-to-head over Catherine Garcia and over Maya Wiley, but by such slim margins that, like, any difference in the number of votes that were wasted, in voter behavior, in tabulation error, or anything could have changed the results. So in a close race like this is where all of those things really come into play. And we ideally would want a method that isn't wasting any votes.
So I guess my final question is, in this kind of environment, what takeaways could we be making to improve future elections if they are to implement ranked choice voting as the method that they imply. Obviously, we could have alternative voting methods, star, et cetera, we've talked about in the past, but for cities looking to implement ranked choice voting, was there any takeaways of preferred design that you think should be implemented?
Yeah, so I want to get more into this exhausted ballot thing that I've mentioned. So in ranked choice voting, if your favorite is a pretty strong underdog candidate, like Maya Wiley, for example, or Catherine Garcia, what that means is that because they're only counting the first choice votes, your first choice stays on that candidate until the very end. So you may well have your favorite eliminated and your next choice is never counted. So for voters who supported Garcia and Wiley, they really were at a mathematical disadvantage compared to Eric Adams voters. And that's predictable. That's something that we were able to predict and say ranked choice voting tends to favor the candidate who's ultimately going to win, and it favors candidates who are eliminated early because their next choices will be counted. And so the reason this comes into play is that in ranked choice, the winner is declared when we reach a majority, but it's not an actual majority of ballots cast. It's a majority of remaining ballots, not counting those exhausted ballots that weren't able to transfer. So if your next choice candidates had already been eliminated, your vote can't transfer. That's an exhausted ballot. And that happened to 117,327 voters in the New York City mayoral primary. So almost a sixth of New York City voters' ballots weren't able to be counted in that deciding round, that final round. So the reason this is able to happen is because ranked choice voting, the type that's been adopted in New York City, is 150 years old. And it was invented to make it really easy to hand count in an era before computers. But the innovation at that time was like, hey, what if we don't count all the rankings and we just count the first choices and do this like round robin thing? But it turns out if you actually do count all the ballot data, you get much more accurate representative results. So there are a lot of alternative voting methods out there, and across the board, methods that count all the ballot data get much better, more representative outcomes, especially in these stress test competitive elections. So for advocates of a ranked voting method, we definitely recommend that you go with one of the Condorcet family of ranked systems, which basically just means they count all the rankings and the candidate preferred over all others wins. Or if you're interested in checking out a different ballot design, star voting also counts all that ballot data. Approval voting also counts all that ballot data. And that is the key to eliminating vote splitting, spoiled ballots, and spoiled elections and wasted votes.
That makes sense to me. So, Sara, now that we're wrapping up, do you have any final words that you want to share with the universal basic people out there who basically just want to know what should we be taking away as this first election from New York City, as well as just ranked choice voting and alternative voting in general? Do you have any final words for them?
Yeah, I think the takeaway here is to be really careful about selling ranked choice voting as the end all be all and selling it with claims that may be rounded up. So when I first got involved in voting reform, I got really excited about voting reform. I was like, I want to vote my conscience. I want my vote to not be wasted. I love ranked choice voting. But as we see, and as ranked choice in New York City really illustrated, it maybe isn't safe to vote your conscience if your favorite is one of the strong underdog candidates. It could cause your vote to not transfer, and your vote can be wasted. So please, for advocates, take a step back from those talking points that have now been really empirically shown to not hold up, especially in the races that are the most important. And I think it should be celebrated that we were able to have an alternative voting election on this scale. But if we sell it as all the problems are solved and this is perfect and it does everything that you want it to, the danger with telling people what they want to hear is that they won't keep fighting for better voting going forward. Or worse, that it could divide the movement and leave us unable to actually get behind a method that does address these valid concerns. So for the good of the movement, I think it's good to celebrate this win for what it is, not oversell it, and use it as a stepping stone to hopefully develop the voting reform movement even further and take it to the next level in coming years and decades.
Yeah, I think what you're kind of acknowledging is having a little bit of humility for its inherent weaknesses. And, you know, each method is going to have some flaws in it, but we can accept that we're making incremental improvement without saying this fixes every part of the problem. We're going to continue to study the field and see what is the best method and continue to advance in that direction. And we've done a lot of empirical research, as you've acknowledged, but I think we also need these examples in practice so that we can really show here's how it actually played out. It's not just this theoretical model, but here's how we actually had it in practice. So I think it's great that we could take the time to analyze this New York City race. So Sara, thank you so much for coming back on the program to talk more about election reform.
Yeah, thank you. And for anyone who's interested in more numbers on this, there's some great articles that have been written. In particular, there's an article by Ben Laviere that I really recommend that we have linked from the Star Voting Press page, and that I think you'll share here. But that really goes into what happened, what happened with spoiled ballots, what happened with exhausted ballots, what happened with wasted votes, what happened with the error where 130,000 ballots were added to the total and that wasn't caught. So all of that, there's a lot more here that we could analyze if we had longer. So for voters who want to read up on that, I really encourage doing it.
Yeah, I will make sure that we have that included. So people who want to find that very conveniently, check down in the description section below to find that link, as well as the Equal Vote Coalition that Sara is a part of, as well as joining us here at the People's Basics. Sara, thank you so much for coming on the program again to talk about voting reform.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, everyone. So again, that was Sara Wolk from the Equal Vote Coalition. We want to encourage you all to come on and talk about the issues that you are most passionate about. We love to talk about the universal basics and the democracy reform necessary to get them done. We are big fans of alternative voting methods, especially star voting. So we want to encourage you all to get involved in these communities so that you can advocate for those specific issues, as well as come in to join us here at the People's Basics. Check the description section down below. You will find all the links that you need to come sign up for an episode yourself, to send us questions, or to become part of the organizing community we have over on Discord. That being said, we want to thank you all for coming and watching another episode of the People's Platform here at the home of the Universal Basics. We will all see you next week.